Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's session. My name is Dee Ryan, and on behalf of Limerick Chamber, I'd like to say thank you very much to Adrian and to Optima Training for assisting and partnering with us in developing our second webinar in addressing the hurdles and the bars ahead of us all in order to be able to safely reopen our workplaces and comply with the government regulations that are in the Return to Work Safely Protocol document. Before I hand you over to Adrian, who's has developed a session for us that's looking more closely at practical steps that you need to address in order to reopen your workplace for your employees, I'd like to just, on the topic of the Return to Work Safety Protocol, advise you that the Chamber is continuing to seek clarification on a number of the requirements specified in the document through our representation on the Labour Employer Economic Forum, which is the forum that the government are using as a sounding board for a lot of measures that they're developing for industry at the moment. We're also working with SkillNet Ireland to develop a COVID-19 officer training course because, as you know from reading the document, we are all required to appoint minimum one and a proportionate number of COVID-19 officers in our workplaces, proportionate to our number of staff, and that person is supposed to have an enhanced understanding of safety measures. So we're working with SkillNet Ireland to develop a course that we can offer to you, and we're also internally in the Chamber working on developing a checklist for employers to assist you with absolutely clarifying that you have all of your preparations made in order to reopen your workplaces as allowed. I also would like to take this opportunity to share with you our perspective as a workplace in the Chamber and how we're approaching this challenge. And really, we have shifted how we're looking at things, and we are not seeing this as a return to work as normal. I'm sure none of you are. We really have understood more better in the last week that what we're doing is we're preparing our workplace to be reopened as a facility for our staff and members of our team to come in on a designated day a week. In split shifts, they won't be crossing over, and that those are the measures that we're working towards in order to reopen our workplace for the members of my team to get a break from remote working and to get in and use the equipment that we have in the office. I understand that that will be different for lots of organizations, and for some of you on the call, that you're essentially that you are a front-facing services and business, and so for some of you, you need to have your business reopened 5 days a week in order to be able to generate revenue. And so Adrian will address a lot of a crossover, a cross section of the common queries that you have today. I just wanted to share that that's our perspective in the Chamber and how we're approaching it from an office perspective. Finally, before I hand over to Adrian, I will also flag with you that today is the opening day for the Restart Grant for small businesses, and that is the grant aid that you may be eligible to apply for. It's based on what you paid for your rates in 2019. The applications are open from now until the 31st of August, and your application can be made using a simple form on the limerick.ie website. I'm going to ask Quiva, our events manager, who's put an awful lot of work into today's session and will be communicating with you after the session. I'm going to ask Quiva to circulate the link to that application form to you if you haven't already seen it. There's also a very helpful FAQ form up on the website that you can take a look at to answer your queries around whether or not you're eligible for it. So with all of that out of the way, I'd like to hand you over to Adrian. Thanks, Adrian.
Thanks very much, Dee. So you're all welcome to the second session of our practical steps and common queries. I suppose we've been quite busy during the week engaging with different offices, businesses, manufacturing facilities in terms of their audits, all the queries they have. So we're getting a good understanding of the challenges that people face, and just from listening to these there, it's always good to get people who are talking about what's happening in their office, how they're engaging with COVID, how they're preparing for COVID, and how they're reorganizing things to make sure they're engaging with physical distancing, infection prevention and control measures. And we'd be very similar to that. We're going to try, and when we come back, we're not fully back up in operation yet ourselves, but it's always good to find out what other people are doing. So we will be arranging the deep clean. We'll be arranging people to come back and get organized, in staggered phases. We'll be altering people's work times. So all of those things that will be done to try and make sure that we don't have a large amount of people, in a small capacity at any point in time. So that's useful as well. Just in terms of something else, a couple of other things that Dee mentioned there to start. So we've also some information there for you in the COVID Restart Grant later on in the presentation. And again, Caoimhe will pop that out to you after the session. So again, thanks to Limerick Chamber, Caoimhe, Dee, and all the staff for having us on this presentation with you. Just wanted to mention as well, I suppose, the compliance. So the compliance course, the compliance officer course, absolutely, it's a requirement. So there's two key elements to that with regard to the return to work protocol. One of which is the compliance officer training. So certainly that's something that we can help with, and we'll be talking to Limerick Chamber on. The other one is lead worker representative. And the lead worker representative is identified in the return to work protocol also as somebody who will work on behalf of the staff members in association with management, very much like a health and safety representative, so appointed, nominated by staff, and they will deal with staff queries, put staff input and considerations to management, and just try and ensure that people are doing what they say they promise they'll do. So a lot of people have great risk assessments and safety statements, but it is about implementing those afterwards. So that's what the lead worker representative will engage in also. So that's just a second training course that might be of interest also. So just going to pop through this, and some of you will have been on last week, and excuse me, some of you won't. So it is training courses that we do, so webinars, e-learning suite of courses, instructor-led, and the consulting, and that's where we're really coming at the COVID point of view in terms of being out and about different companies, different organizations of different types, and the various, as I said, questions, challenges, and obstacles that they're facing there at the moment. So that's what we're talking about. I won't necessarily go through that, but we can see that when we send on the questions, the presentation afterwards. My own details, you can contact me in any way you want afterwards, and we have some resources up on our own website there as well, some templates and some information that might be of use to anyone, so anyone can pop onto that and they can get it directly off the website. So our experience in the last week, I suppose, just updated from the last presentation, has really been, about the practical steps that people are doing. So people are beginning to very much engage with this now and take it a little bit more seriously than they were previously. As I would have said last week, it's very much seen as a health and safety issue up to now, but now people are beginning to realize there's so much more to it. And the real practical considerations, queries that we're getting from all the webinars that we're doing from around the country at the moment. And, it's great to get those questions because we're trying to solve problems for people, and that's what we're doing. So we have the COVID compliance officer, which become a big thing for people over this week. Then the lead worker representative is another factor for people. So we're beginning to see a lot more engagement on our own training courses and questions about those from us. The other training that's becoming very relevant is the safe use of PPE. So, I mean, it's great to have PPE and it's great to be provided with PPE by staff, but not every staff member knows how to use it correctly. So the storage, the safety of putting it on, taking it off, how long to hold on to it, face fitting for masks, what suits what person. So that's a challenge for people and not necessarily something that's there and available to all staff members. We have that as a webinar, but also we have it as an e-learning course as well. In terms of consulting, then what we're tending to do is the audits, the safety statements, risk assessments, response plans, all of those different things. And then we're looking at people, how prepared they are, how compliant they are. And while there's not a way of necessarily certification to say somebody should be ready to open, we just double check on all those audit steps to make sure people are fully compliant. And I was having a conversation with my own insurance broker there not too long ago, and getting advice on that as regard to what people can expect from their insurer, and just making sure that's one of the key things that they will be looking for. Where there's claims in relation to COVID, or if there's a COVID case within companies, I certainly think that the insurance companies will be looking at us and saying, okay, have you got your policies and procedures in place? Had you all mitigating factors there to prevent this from happening? And basically, if we haven't, I think that's where we could run into problem just from an insurance point of view alone. So I think we definitely need to have all our policies and procedures and documentation right for COVID. And I think just because it says there's a phase where our business can reopen, that's not enough to say we can reopen our business. Without having a safety statement, risk assessment, and compliance documentation, our business shouldn't be open. And it's basically essentially as simple as that. So what are the common things we're coming across? First of all, is the lack of clarity in interpretations. And one of the things I'll talk about later on in this slide is just the, as regards even temperature monitoring, contact tracing. So there are two of the issues that are really becoming clear to people, or sorry, issues for people. Yesterday we would have seen, if you were watching, the news and, some of the other TV, in relation to problems with regard to how things are being interpreted in terms of contact logging and how much time we should be spending, whether it's close contact with 15 minutes with less than 2 meters, or also whether it might be, more than 2 hours in a closed area. And, people were taking, just like they were at the time of GDPR, people are taking very extreme interpretations of these, sometimes if it suits themselves. For example, there was, in the Dáil, there was people that wouldn't have meetings for more than 2 hours. Whereas it's very clear in the return to work protocol that, you look at the documentation, you look at the risk assessment. So basically, if you have a big open area and you have people in there for, it could be 2 hours, it could be 8 hours, it doesn't really make any difference. It's the risk assessment of where you are is the more important thing, rather than the fact that it's 2 hours. Where that has come from, it's come from the contact tracing, which says basically, or the contact logging, where your employees now have a duty to log any contacts with whom they would have been within 50, for 15 minutes or more within a 2 meter distance. But it also extends that to anyone within a enclosed space, a confined space, enclosed space that you might have been with for more than 2 hours. So that's where the interpretation came from there. But it's very much, I think, more likely that you should be looking at your risk assessment and determining whether that person who is on your contact tracing log, what needs to happen with them. So it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody in a large open area, industrial environment, would have to, be self-isolated because they were in near enough to somebody for more than 2 hours. That's typically not the case, but it is your risk assessment. It's all important. Again, the lack of understanding of the importance of the risk assessment is key. Without that risk assessment, as I said a moment ago, your business should not be open. Everything is based on risk. So the phases are guidelines for business to open, and they can open if everything else is in place at that time. Whereas a lot of businesses, I think, are saying, yeah, we can reopen on, whether it's in May or the 18th of May, or whether it's the 29th of July, it doesn't make any difference, because that's the date that we can all reopen. It's not, it's the day we can reopen if basically we have everything in place. A lot of HR issues, and concerns around, just even around contact tracing, contact logging, around temperature monitoring, around the employment handbook, and around data protection concerns as well. So, where people are temperature monitoring, there's, there's different interpretations as to whether that's permitted to record those temperatures or not. Having looked at that situation and having done some work in terms of GDPR and data protection, I think it's manageable, but obviously we have to look at our policies and procedures that we have in place. So we have to look at our data protection policy, and we have to update that if we're going to be storing and medical data. Who has going to access to it? What controls, what security controls we have in place? What legal basis do we have to have it, or what basis do we have for holding it? And then who has access to it, for how long are we storing it, and how are we deleting it? So all of those questions have to be answered in terms of temperature monitoring if we're going to store that data. Just going back to the HR concerns, and we probably talked about them in a little while, will be things like how we are managing absenteeism, which is an ongoing concern for businesses. 60% of the businesses that we've engaged with have viewed absenteeism, unauthorized absenteeism from one form or another, as being a critical issue for their business. So how are we going to bring people back? And we have a couple of ideas, a couple of conversational topics around that. Just a reminder on the reopening phases there, and so we're fully clear, and we will have seen, from around even Limerick over the last week or so, as construction, landscaping, hardware have come back. It's brought a huge amount of traffic back to the area, and we can see a lot more people out and about. So certainly there's a lot more businesses open. On the 8th of June, we'll have smaller retailers and libraries. On the 29th of June, we'll have creches for essential workers, and we're waiting clarity on how that's actually going to work. We're being told we're talking about working with children in teams of pods, but there's a difficulty in terms of, physical distancing for children. In terms of temperature monitoring for children and or parents, facilities about how we manage children who have high temperatures. So there's a load of things. Also, how many people are going to come back, and how we're going to choose who comes back, to who's considered essential, how we prioritize various essential workers over another essential workers. So all of these are critical factors that need to be clarified, and we're working with that sector, I suppose, in the other elements that we have, but we're waiting clarification from the government on things like schools and creches as how best they're going to reopen and what are the criteria in which they have. For example, if they can only bring back 1/3 of their, their children, is that going to be financially viable for them to do so? Or are the government supports going to be available to bridge that gap between what they can do and their full normal, custom? On the 20th of July, then we're looking at childcare and the hairdressers, churches. So that's going to be childcare for everybody else, essentially. That's the date that most creches will be looking at. And a lot of people will be eager for that date, not just because they have children at home, but obviously because, there's pressure coming on people from businesses as they're trying to get back to work. Not everybody can work from home, as Dee mentioned at the start. So it suits some people, it suits a lot of office people, maybe sales, different things. But what if you're at the production floor? Obviously, you can't do your production floor work from your home via a broadband, so that's an issue. And the last phase then will be on the 10th of August, phase 5, where the other retailers, based on a risk assessment, can open up, and that will be the larger retailers, luxury items, non-essential. Okay, just going to launch, hopefully via Quiva. Hopefully going to pop this out. So is your business currently open? Just like to get a handle on the amount of businesses that are currently open and just get an estimate based on who we have with us today, how many are open and how many are not. Okay. Is that available to you on screen there? Okay, there might be an issue with that poll. Okay, it's coming in now, so it's just taking a moment. So, okay, so the answer to that, so really was, we have about 80% to 20%. So 80% of businesses are open from people on this webinar, and we have 20% not, so 79-21. That's interesting. It's just come off a webinar earlier on today with participants from Donegal, and basically they were the other extreme. So it was only 20% of them were open, 80% weren't. So it's useful to know that information. So most of us here are already open. So therefore, 80% of us, in this webinar should have our safety statement, should have our risk assessment, and should have our safety documentation already in place. Now, they're obviously changing day after day, so there's new things coming on board for us that we have to be aware of. But as a minimum, we should be looking at those documents as critical. Thank you. Okay, so just go on to the next area there, and another poll. So we're going to ask, are you having issues, or if not, do you foresee issues in getting staff back to work? If you could address that one for us. Okay, so the results are fairly strong in favor, even at this point, of approximately coming in at 70-30, 75-25, so 75% of businesses. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're kind of having an estimate of about 60% of the businesses in which we engage with on these webinars are having issues in terms of bringing staff back to work. On this particular webinar, we're having 73% of the businesses here are having those issues. So that's a huge challenge for people, and a huge challenge that we need to try and get over. So it's basically 74-26 is the final result there from your votes. So thanks for voting on that. And it gives us great information and data, and allows people to see what are the key challenges about us all getting back to work. There's obviously very legitimate issues in terms of whether people can or cannot get back to work. But I suppose we have to try and find out what that is, and then we have to try and engage with that process. And we also have to try and engage with our staff and negotiate with our staff. So there's several approaches we can take. But there's one other question we got coming up straight after this now, and I just want to see if we can get your feedback on that, which would be great as well. Of the 4 reasons identified, what do you feel is the biggest reason for the difficulties in bringing staff back to work? So of those 4 options, which of these do you feel is the biggest reason for having staff coming back to work, having challenges of that? Okay, so we're getting question A and B are getting a lot of feedback, much less than typically on question C or answer C in relation to financial incentives. So we're having approximately 54% of you have said that it's down to health and safety concerns and fears of staff, that they're not sure of their own safety and security as they come back to work. At least, a lot of that is something we can address. So that's a positive, I suppose, that most of the issues are around that, because they're something we have control over. There are things we can put in place. We can put our physical distance, we put our infection control measures, our health and safety measures in place, our business continuity. We can address much of that. Issues with childcare availability is 38% of you have said that that's the issue. Now, that's a much more difficult process, because people don't have childcare availability. If those people are working at home, or if those people have no other option but who's going to mind their children, then it's very, very difficult and almost impossible for them to come back to work. So that's a real key challenge for people. How we can address that is really, we have to look at the timelines involved, look at other options to see how we can get our children minded, or look at flexibility from employers as well to see, can we work remotely? Can we continue to work remotely? Issues regarding financial incentives came at 4%. That's a little bit less than what we were finding as we do the audits to clients, in that a lot of them are saying, that they do have people on the financial incentives, like the, not the wage subsidy scheme, but the COVID layoff scheme, which would be, it's not so much an issue for sectors which are high payers. But for sectors where are low payers, typically those type of industries are sectors where the average rate is on the lower side, hospitality maybe, for example, then it's much more difficult to bring those staff back when that €350 is actually serving as a disincentive in some ways. That's according to the employers that we're talking about for bringing back. And then there was 4% as well for lack of a planning or engagement with employers. And even though it mightn't be a significant percentage, it's definitely something that employers need to be very aware of, and trying to communicate out plans to their staff about how they're going to bring their staff back to work, what the office or manufacturing facility or whatever the case may be is going to look like when they come back, what changes they will have made to the facilities, also what changes they will have made to the policies and procedures, what they can expect re-signage, what they can expect to make sure that they're fully convinced and confident in their own safety and security when they do return to work. And that will be very much the same for people who interface with clients. So whether it's hairdressers, whether it's beauty sector, it doesn't make any difference. It will depend, your clients and how happy they are to come back into your custom will be very much dependent on what steps you have made to engage and communicate out to them that you are ready for their return, such as signage, floor markings, all the other things that we can do, and we'll talk about shortly. So I'm just going to go on to the next area, and that's the return to work protocol. And I spoke a little bit about it last week, but it is, as I said, the most important document that has been released. And really it guides everything we're doing, and it's trying to come back in such a way that we make sure we don't have that big spike in temperature in virus when we come back, and that we're not looking at pulling back on some of the the facilities that have been made available to us in terms of reopening over the next number of weeks. So it is about, and I said last week as well, it's all about staff and the employer engaging together. So it's not just down to the employer to manage this, it's also down to, there's a duty of care and an onus on staff also to engage with this return to work safety protocol. And that's very much borne by the people who are going to be identified as, the appointment of key personnel. So we have the COVID response manager. We're going to have a communications coordinator. Now, some of that might be the same person even. But the two new ones really there in terms of return to work protocol have been the COVID compliance officer and the lead worker representative. And again, we're doing quite a lot of work in that area in terms of training courses for people. It is mandatory training. It doesn't say how that training needs to be done, so it can be done, in a number of ways. But we are one avenue of approach for that, and certainly we're finding quite busy in terms of people booking onto those courses. So the compliance officer will obviously have a key role in terms of the adherence and conformance to the guidance and to the standards and to the provisions that have been laid out, whereas your lead worker representative will be, representing the staff in conversations and in dialogue with management about how best to implement, the responses to COVID challenges. The safety statement I spoke about last week, but again, it's just such an important document that we need to make sure that we have that in place. And we're getting a lot of people saying in audits, so yes, but sure, I updated it there in December. The fact that it was updated in December, is irrelevant really. Although it has to be updated annually, it now must be updated to COVID policies and procedures. And then, the areas of that will be the policy, the scope, who's going to be responsible for what arrangements and procedures have you put in place, and what controls have you put in place? How have you reduced the risk involved? And with the risk, we're talking about bringing in our risk assessments. So they go hand in hand, the safety statement and our risk assessments. So our risk assessment will form part of the safety statement. And they're going to be important then to have that. So really, in terms of COVID, what we're looking for from yourselves is to have those risk assessments completed, not just a general risk assessment that we would have completed previously, but now a risk assessment very much related to COVID and the likelihood of COVID happening to your business, and then the consequences, how severe those consequences are likely to be if it does happen. So based on not having any controls, we're essentially looking at the situation and saying, without any controls in place, it's obviously a very high likelihood that our business could be impacted by COVID. And what's the severity, how severe could the consequence be? Well, it could actually be fatal. So it could be fatal for employees, or it could ruin your business. So there's a number of things that can happen there. So that would be very, very high risk rating. And we use the risk matrix that's there on that slide, or something similar to that, to look at the risk rating. And we multiply basically the likelihood of something happening versus multiply by the consequence of it happening, the severity of the consequence. And that's how we get our risk rating. So what do? We identify, as I said, the hazards, we identify the risk, we look at the current controls we have in place, and then we look at the gap between what we have in place and what we need. We then put the controls in place which are going to mitigate or reduce that risk, and then we review that risk rating again. Now, that should cause that risk rating to be significantly decreased after all the controls we put in place. That's not enough on its own. The return to work protocol is very clear that you need ongoing monitoring, audit, and auditing of that risk assessments, so to make sure that people are actually complying with it. And if people aren't, then additional controls need to be put in place. If it's not succeeding, so if you are having people, just say for example, in the meat processing sector, so obviously the controls they have in place in those in some of that sector, isn't sufficient. So obviously they need to put additional controls in place, and also the controls they put in place, it's not just enough to have controls in place. You must monitor. And that's where the compliance officer will come in. You need to monitor the fact that all these things are in place and that they're being actually adhered to. So you can't turn a blind eye. You can't say that masks are mandatory and then have your staff just ignore that and say, I'll wear them when I feel like them. You must look at this in very much a way that you would look at every other health and safety consequence. So if somebody wasn't wearing their hard hat on a construction site, there would be sanctions about that. There should also be sanctions if people aren't adhering to this, because if they're not adhering to it, then your risk assessments aren't in place, and really as a result of that, your business should not be open. So just a layout and the matrix, and we have some soft copies of this and we can send around as an example of people, in Word format, how people might lay out their risk assessments. What else do we need to do? So our documentation, and I know Dee had mentioned a couple of things on that in terms of compliance checklists. It's actually a very good audit checklist on the HSA website, and so have a look at that return to work safely. So there's about 7 different documents on that are very useful. We have our own audit document that we use as we're working with businesses to ask them the pertinent questions that we feel are going to give us the answers, so we can then build a risk assessment from there. So we have a COVID response plan and we have a return to work questionnaire. The return to work questionnaire must be sent out to staff 3 days in advance of them returning to work as a minimum. For people that would already say we're back at work, then it needs to be given to those staff now at this point and let them fill out the questionnaire. That's basically a self-declaration which says they haven't, been exposed to COVID, they haven't been diagnosed with COVID, they haven't any of the symptoms related to COVID, and they're not going to represent a challenge or a risk, to your work environment. You also have your COVID reinduction forms. They're the forms when you bring your staff back, that you need to make sure you tick off to sign off to say that your staff have been made aware of all the policies and procedures and received any training necessary for COVID response. Your contact tracing log. So whether you do that manually or whether you do it via an app, we have to have some way now of documenting who we were in close contact with for 15 minutes or more, or also in terms of who we were in the confined space for 2 hours or more. Now that can be a group of people, typically for the 2 hours or more, because most facilities will be within, in an enclosed space, so, an office space, for example, and they will be with them for most of the day. It doesn't necessarily mean that there's going to be, a lot of things we'll need to do as a result of somebody becoming compromised by COVID, especially if they're a long distance away from somebody and they haven't been in close contact with them. But it is a matter, their risk assessment needs to be created then if there is a COVID diagnosis as to what we need to do with the people who were there for 2 hours or more. But it's just not necessarily the case that it's automatic, self-isolation or anything like that. For the people in close contact, there would be more likely. So that risk assessment is more likely identified that, there's a real chance that they might have contracted the virus off somebody who has a positive diagnosis because they were in such close contact, especially if they weren't wearing PPE, masks, gloves, etc. So visitor contractor also should have a reinduction. So as they come back into your facility, they should have a reinduction just like your staff would. And they should also have a declaration. And there's a school of thought that would say, as people would come into your, even not necessarily retail, but somebody who would come into, for example, I had somebody on a previous webinar from, beauty therapists and hairdressers, and they were saying they could be with somebody in close contact for 2 hours minimum or more. So it is a matter then of looking at things like that for what PPE? Are we going to insist on PPE for our clients, or are we going to get them to sign a declaration which basically says that they don't have, or to the best of their knowledge, they haven't come in contact with anyone who has had COVID? How are we going to look after ourselves? And we might decide, oh, I can't ask somebody to do that. But from a return to work protocol point of view, we have to take every step possible to ensure the safety of our staff. So we have to engage with that and see what's reasonable and not reasonable to ask people to do in terms of not really retail, because if you go into your local, large multiple in terms of your groceries, you're not going to be asked to sign a declaration. But now there is guidance to say that you should be wearing a mask. So there are things happening and changing all the time on that. Sorry, apologies on that. Bear with me one moment. Sorry, I just clicked on the link there rather than the next slide, so apologies. Sorry now. Sorry about that, just a slight issue there on the apologies. Okay, I think we're back up and running now. Okay, so that was the audit checklist. Apologies, I just clicked on the link which opened up browsers, which did all sorts of damage there, so apologies on that. So just going back into another poll that I have for you there, just another question. So do you currently, or do you intend on, when you return to work, monitor the temperature of employees? So if you're open already, are you monitoring that temperature? And basically, if you're back already, so, or if you're not already returned, are you intending to monitor the temperature of that? And I think Quiva has a poll to go out on that. Okay. Not sure if that's coming up, Quiva, there for you. Okay, so what we have on that is it's coming up there at 18% for people who are so they're going to attend, they're going to temperature monitor. We have 64% of people who are not, and then we have 18% who are not sure. Okay, it's an interesting result, because I suppose within the return to work protocol, it says we have to take some way of risk assessing whether our staff might have been exposed or maybe exposed to COVID. And how are we going to risk assess if we're choosing not to monitor the temperature of employees? We've received some advice, it's not necessarily completely unambiguous, that would say that if you don't take steps to do this, then you may be open, your business may potentially be open to a claim into the future, because you haven't carefully risk assessed how whether your staff member may have COVID, may have been exposed to COVID, or may be likely to transfer that COVID onto other members of staff. So it's an interesting question, and that's an interesting answer, that so many people aren't going to engage in that. I suppose we, as a company, we have intended to engage in temperature monitoring, and I think it's something that we'll need to do, because we have to take some risk assessment from the return to work protocol to say whether our staff are likely to have been exposed, as I said, or transfer that to somebody else or spread that virus. There is very little other ways that we can actually manage to risk assess that carefully, because it's not an exact science either, because 60% of cases are probably up to that research has shown are asymptomatic, which basically means there is no symptoms associated with it, so they may not even have a temperature regardless. So it's definitely not a panacea, or it's not the result, the answer to all questions, but it certainly is a way of risk assessing. And if we don't do it that way, how are we going to do it? If you are going to do it, just another question, how are you intending to do it? So is it going to be via, the company representative records the temperature? Is it going to be technology such as camera scans? Is it going to be the employee will record their own temperature on site, or will an employee record their own temperature at home? So if we can vote on that one there. So there should be a poll launched there for you now at the moment, and that will give you access. So company representative records. Okay, so what would be the preference in terms of how people would engage with that? And from dealing with different companies, we're finding a huge variety of responses on this. We're finding more, almost every company we have engaged with are actually temperature monitoring. So many of them are, talking to construction companies this morning, they were engaging in that. In Dublin, they were doing it multiple times per day. In terms of temperature checking, creches tend to do it very regularly when they're open. So the results of this have come in at 14%, we'll say company representative will do it. Again, another 14% saying technologies such as camera scans. 33% say their employee will record their own temperature on site, and 38%, so the most, will say their employee will record their own temperature at home. And actually, interestingly enough, that's the approach. Approach 4 is the one that we're going with ourselves. So we have actually engaged, in terms of, we're going procuring thermometers, the infrared thermometers for our staff, and we're going to ask them to record their temperature at home before they come to work. The logic behind that is that really we don't want staff coming to work if they're ill. In any case, regardless of whether it's COVID related or any other illness related, they shouldn't be at work if somebody isn't well. So we're going to record that via an app. We're working with somebody at the moment on that, Lean BPI. I think I might have a screenshot of that coming up. So they will actually, on their phones, they will actually record, if they have a temperature above 38 degrees any given day, and that information will be stored securely and safely, and password protected, so it'll be encrypted as well. So we're taking care of our GDPR concerns like that as well, and we're not having then staff asking other staff members to record other staff at work. So there's different angles, different interpretations on it, and we're waiting some more clarity on it. But that's our procedure for now, is that we're going to have employees, as the return to work protocol protocol says, we are going to be asking staff to do that, because basically there's a shared responsibility between management and staff, and there's a duty of care on staff to let us know if they're not well. So that's the angle we're taking there. And people might disagree with that particular one and have their own idea. So basically we're asking on temperature scanning, so how do you risk assess possible COVID cases? How are we going to do it? What technology are we going to use? I mean, as I said, it's not an exact science. It's not, these aren't calibrated technologies. So the small infrared scanners just give you a guidance. And, what temperature are we looking at? Generally speaking, around 38.0 degrees. What procedure are we making? The limitations to it, it does not determine that you have COVID. It only tells you have a raised temperature, and that can be for a variety of reasons. But one way or another, if you have a raised temperature, you shouldn't really be in a work environment. How about GDPR? How we're going to manage that? Security, safety, access to that data, controls in place for that data, and then what response will we actually take if somebody does have COVID? That's people are using very simple forms, or people are also using apps and things like that on phones and other technologies to make sure that people can log the temperature. And really, you probably only need to log the temperature, in my point of view, if you have a temperature that's more than 38 degrees. And that's the only one that I'm really interested in retaining. The reason I need to retain that maybe is for illness benefit payments or checks back after the case, if anybody has queries after the event as to why they were paid or they weren't paid, depending on your illness policy. You would need maybe to have that on record. If you do detect COVID, what are the items that you need to look at? So the return to work protocol also specifies the isolation area. So we need to identify now an isolation area that's going to be used if somebody has COVID in our workforce. Ideally, we'd get them to go home if we can, as soon as possible, as soon as we become aware. But if we can't, we have to have that isolation area. If they can't get home on their own devices, we obviously need to arrange transport for them if they're very unwell. They go to their medical professional. They turn up for their testing if they're advised, and if it's a negative result, so if they don't get diagnosed with COVID, basically we have to determine with our own policies whether that person can return to work or they need a certificate to return to work. If they do have COVID, they have to self-isolate for a minimum of 14 days, and the last 5 of those days should be symptom-free. You obviously can request a return to work certificate for those people who would have self-isolated who have COVID. You can also request for people who haven't as well, and that's your right as an employer. And then a contract tracing log. So if somebody has COVID, then we need to go back over the contract logs and find out the people who would have been in close contact with them and do that risk assessment and put our plans in place for that. And also for the people that are within a longer spacing, over 2 hours or more. The isolation area is just a room that needs to be dedicated. It needs to be identified now. It needs to be confidential, have a closed door ideally, and then it needs to be stocked with PPE and hygiene products plus a clinical waste bag. If somebody is in there and has use of that, then it should be closed until it's cleaned professionally. So that's your isolation area. just some things in infection prevention and control measures. Again, just the cleaning and the the deep clean of the fogging, whatever procedure you're going to use for your cleaning. Your sanitizing station at common touch points, so things like printers and clocking systems, handrails. Clocking systems are an interesting one. We've been told that as far as practicable, we have to look after the welfare of our staff and we have to stop them using anything that might transfer the virus. So unless we have significant controls in place, such as sanitizing stations and any other facilities that we can make available to people, we should try and avoid the use of fingerprint clocking systems that everybody has to go and touch. Some people, obviously, if they have enough controls in place, it's not that it's banned, it's just that it's stated that there should be all other controls, all other technology should be considered before we use something that could spread the virus like that. So we minimize the risk and we reduce the risk. PPE policy, it's up to you whether you determine your business needs gloves, masks, visors, and that's your procedures. They're not mandatory, but you can make them mandatory within your organization. All the signage, so door signage, floor signage, hygiene station signage, etiquette for coughing and sneezing. Directions re physical contact and distancing. How are we going to distance people? How are we going to make sure they do that? Maybe with signage, guidance. How about limitations on the numbers in the areas, such as canteens and meeting rooms, making sure that we're not going back in having long extended meetings in a small boardroom with multiple people. We should be looking at seeing, can we still have our meetings remotely? So we're trying to limit numbers in any area at any given time. So personal hygiene, things like clothes, shoes, and phones. So things that people, they go home from one area to another, maybe an industrial area or work area to their home. And there are things that maybe people forget about sometimes that can lead to the spread of the virus and bring home a virus from one environment to another. So it's just the cleaning and the hygiene of that as well. That was shared actually with me last night by a friend of mine who's a medical professional. And, it just showed the value from the medical professionals side of things from masks. So a transmission rate from somebody who doesn't have a mask, somebody who does, can be up to 70%. Somebody with a mask to without a mask would be approximately 5%. And then with a mask to somebody with a mask is down to about 1.5%. You can see the value of PPE. But as I mentioned earlier on, PPE is only valuable if people know how to use it appropriately. So sometimes I think the view has been, we don't want people to think PPE is the answer to all their concerns and suddenly you don't become invincible because you have gloves and a mask on. There's still a real threat there, so you have to try and manage that. So what I want you to do is in the chat box, just want you to answer. A lot of people are asking us, and a lot of people might be asking yourselves, where's the best locations for you? And we can share that information with some of yourselves afterwards and say, here are some suggested locations where you reach out to get your signage, get your screen barriers, your sanitizing gel. If you could take just a couple of seconds and maybe pop something into the chat menu there, and we can see what people are saying in terms of where are the best places to go and get that type of environment. Everybody needs signage. A lot of people will need barriers. Everybody needs sanitizing gel. A lot of people will need gloves and masks. So people have been asking us all the time, can we recommend places where we get some of these items? And we have our own people that we know do a very good job on things like this. Throw out a couple of names, sign links for signage, but I'm not suggesting people go to one rather than another. We have M2 Office Supplies that we work with. So there's a number of people that we work with, CTech Medical. They're all places we know, but other people might have good ideas that they would like to share around with other people, because it's a question we get asked in every single location that we go to. People saying, okay, have you anywhere you'd recommend that we would go for barriers for our desks? So it's a real concern that people have, and some people don't know where to go, and they might be reaching out to places that maybe are charging a huge amount of money for things like this. So if anybody has any suggestions, they can type it in, or when we follow up after this, they're welcome to share that with us, and I can share out a couple of locations that would be useful for people. Just in terms of facility management and the different things we might need. So we talked about signage, we talked about floor markings, and we were also talking about the screens on desks and things like that. We're also talking about things like hygiene stations, physical markings, signage and floor markings. We have one-way systems in a lot of areas. So when people go onto corridors, basically there's a right of way, a traffic light system to allow people on. We have door management security. So what's stopping somebody walking into your facility? Is there any control measures in place to stop them, to prevent unauthorized access? How about the physical barriers and hatches for desks? Things like the catering, canteen and washrooms, how are we going to manage those facilities? Temperature station, where is it and how are we engaged with that? And also our isolation room, have we identified it? the use of technology and remote working, we should still be engaging with that even if we're under the same building, rather than having meetings in a small boardroom potentially with lots of people. Ventilation and air quality might be a very simple process for an office, but if you're in a manufacturing industrial facility, it might be a much more challenging area in terms of filtration, in terms of extraction, in terms of, I was talking to as a person I know in that industry, Dave from Breeze Air, and he was talking to me about that issue. So there's a lot of people who will help you out with that area, but it's an important factor as well in terms of how likely the virus is to spread. Waste management, clinical waste bags, so having access to those things. And then the suggestions that we had re physical distancing, such as the phased reopening of offices. So not everybody comes back at one point. The mix of remote and office space people, if that's possible. Shift patterns and staggered times. So can we work 7:30, 7:45, 8 a.m.? Can we limit the number of people that are coming into the business at any one time? We mentioned the online platform meetings. Can we continue with those? Can we have work specialization? So a lot of the manufacturing facilities we're talking to now are working in small pods, small teams. They work and break together, and they specialize their work together. So I suppose the risk assessment there is, how likely is it to happen? And it still might, a virus might still be likely to happen now. If they're all wearing PPE, we can mitigate those controls. But how severe can it be in terms of the general work population? It's more likely to impact a small group of people than it is a large group of people. From an individual risk assessment, there's still a high risk there. From a business continuity risk assessment, there's a much lower risk. Restrict physical contact in all ways, so handshakes and any other physical contact we would have. Limit carpooling, flights, public transport, anywhere people might be in enclosed space. Recently, a lot of us will have received an email from Ryanair or other flight companies about all the things they're doing in terms of air circulation, all the controls they're putting in place. We want to limit on-site contractors and visitors only to be essential. If you're not essential, you shouldn't be there. Queue management, how are we engaging with that? Like shops and stores are doing that for electronic payments. Set times for deliveries and collections. Isolate individual buildings. Set staff, on the same equipment. So that's back to the work specialization. Can we use the same piece of equipment? Or we had a facility there who basically everyone went to the same IT system, put in and keyed in their data. Now they've changed, basically they put a control measure in place, so they have one person who does that and everybody else sends the information to them. So again, not everybody has to touch that machine now or those keys. So any movement of items such as printers and wiping down items such as printers, facilities that everybody touches are very important to have wipe down hygiene and make sure it's as clean as possible. A couple of other things just before we wrap up in terms of HR concerns. So first of all, the employment handbook, I mentioned that. We're going to need to update that if we're bringing in temperature scanning, if we're bringing in new disciplinary measures or sanctions, if we're bringing in short-term working. Even if we're asking people to change around their shift, we have to engage with staff on that. The back to work questionnaire for HR, 3 days notice has to be given, and then they might have an involvement in the COVID reinductions. They might have a role in contact tracing. So if somebody does have the virus diagnosed, how are they going to go back over? And they might have a role in that. Supports for staff. So reaching out to staff, communicating with staff, making sure everything's okay. Employment assistance programs. So offering the staff the support that they might need in terms of even things like DSE as well. I mentioned last week, display screen equipment, making sure people have the provisions they should have in place if, remote working is going to continue into the future. Communication of the policies that we have, such as sick pay. Everyone should have full clarity on whether there's sick pay or no sick pay. If they have to isolate, is there sick pay, no sick pay? If they're sent away for the day because they have a raised temperature, is that paid for? So do we have different sick leave policies on COVID than we do normally? I think if an employee was to contract the virus at work and it was seen to have been contracted at work, I think they would have a reasonable expectation that maybe, they might have been paid. In terms of training and development, they might have a role in that in terms of HR. So all the different training types that we might be doing, whether it's face-to-face with physical distancing, whether it's remote live webinars, and then, things like PPE, mandatory training. So, mandatory training like things like, manual handling, for example, people moving and handling, that hasn't been extended, where the likes of first aid response, first aid has been extended, certificates have been extended. And other items have been extended, but things like manual handling and people moving and handling have not. So you're still open in that if you're back in business and your certificates have expired, we have to take steps to try and make sure we're all certified at this point. And GDPR, we're holding medical data. We're also working from home. We should have working from home policy. We're also using IT. So are we secure? Are we safe? Are our systems safe? Are we storing our data safely and compliantly? So we should have our ICT policy forwarded out to people as well. And then the different challenges people have, as I mentioned earlier on, typically a lot of them are around the communication issue, the absenteeism issue, the people not coming back to work, and then, communicating out on the policies, on the inductions, on the questionnaires. Also, I mentioned last week on the WSS, the wage subsidy scheme, to make sure that people are aware that there might be a tax liability into the future on something like that. Just final word then on the supports. So the wage subsidy scheme is still in operation. So 70, right up to 85% of affected staff whose turnover had decreased significantly is still being paid. And the guidance is that is likely to continue over the next number of weeks as a minimum. The COVID layoff scheme might be more at risk in terms of what people are looking at. And as more and more people say that, they're having difficulties in bringing staff back to work, both, childcare arrangements and the disincentives to come back to work are factors that need to be considered. And it's political football, I suppose, in a way, so it can be difficult to do. But if somebody's working and they're paid €450 and somebody now is working at home with €350 and basically don't have childcare or don't have those costs, you can, it's understandable that person won't be entirely motivated to necessarily come back to work as soon as possible. So the waiving commercial rates is another item there. So if that's for a 3-month period, so not a deferral, but a waiving of those for people affected. Annual returns and tax returns deferred into March. Warehousing tax liabilities unrequired. Business continuity voucher actually expired last Friday, so there was a huge requirement for that. There was a huge amount of applications in, so I know there's a backlog in that. So if you have applied for the business continuity voucher, it closed last Friday, but anyone who got their application in, I know there's a lot of people waiting feedback on that from the local enterprise office, but there's a huge amount of applications went in on the last number of days, they're telling me. Trading online vouchers available through the local enterprise office, and again, that's very much in relation to €2,500 for businesses to get online or to expand their presence online, their brand online, their digital marketing online, so they can sell more online and have a better presence. So what is normally the case that €2,500 has to be matched, whereas at the moment, €2,500 only has to be matched with 10% with €250. The SBCI capital working capital loans is a loan scheme, 4% interest rate, and basically it has to be repaid over 1 to 3 years. And then Dee mentioned at the start, so I've added it here as well, the COVID Restart Grant. So it's based on 2019 rates payment that you might have made. And you can get a minimum of €2,000 right up to a maximum €10,000 rebate if you're eligible for that. That opens today, and as Dee said, it's open via limerick.ie. So definitely worth applying for that, checking it out, checking do you fulfill the criteria to get that. I've been saying to people last week on one of the slides, it's an important time, and I've heard people say in business, we don't want supports, we don't need supports. We've never taken supports in the past. Yet, a lot of these businesses and small businesses need to protect their long-term future, need to protect their viability, need to protect their staff as well. So if you, fulfill the criteria, and if you have paid out those rates, and if you've paid out those amounts of money and you're due those payments, it would be, unfortunate not to engage in this process and try and get back something that might enable your business to survive, because we're not at the end of this process. There's a lot of costs involved in COVID. There's a lot of requirements there that people will be coming back with less people, maybe with less clients. So just right now on the day we open doesn't mean everything's going to go back to normal. A lot of the policies and procedures we have put in place, and this is what people need to understand, are going to be there for the long-term future. If we put up barriers on desks, they're not going to come down in 2 months' time, 3 months' time. A lot of the facilities and the requirements that we have with COVID and the return to work protocol are going to be here for the long run and are here to stay. So there's going to be a cost in association with COVID and COVID compliance into the long run, and that might be even from additional resources for compliance managers. I was talking to a construction company this morning, and they have recruited people exactly for that purpose. So that's an ongoing cost to them, for example. Okay, just a link to some key documents there as well that we'll have access to from the follow-ups, the NACI document, the Government Return to Work Safety Protocol, the Reopening Business Protocol, and the HSE guidance. So there are a number of documents that might be useful for you. And just some of the courses that we do ourselves, I suppose, in this area, I'd be ashamed not to plug ourselves while we're here, would be the practical steps. We have Compliance Manager, 3-hour course. We have a Lead Worker Representative, 2-hour course. We have business supports, risk assessments, audits, and safety statements. So they're very short-term courses for anyone who actually wants to know how to create that safety statement, how to create that risk assessment. And we're working continually with Limerick Chamber, and we thank them greatly for having us deliver this presentation, also for working with us and supporting us over the last number of months in this as well. So we do that full audit and documentation as well. So that's kind of the end of the presentation that I have for you. There's plenty of information, I suppose. Hopefully it will clarify maybe a few of the things that we actually need to go and do. So if I was to put them in order, your safety statement, your risk assessment, your safety documentation in terms of return to work and compliance and audit checklists. We need to look at how we're going to risk assess people, as whether they might have the, COVID or not. So we need to identify whether we're going to do temperature scanning or not. We need to get our contact logging system in place. And we need to put our infection control measures in place. We need to put our physical distancing control measures in place. So all of those things are different items we need to do. And look, we need to do our training courses as well. We need to upskill, and we need to identify what we need to do and how we need to do it. So that's the different kind of things I think people need to engage with, as well as the supports and continuity as well, and making sure their business continues in the long term. And that we give the staff, when they do come back, we're optimistic, and we let them know, obviously, that our business is going to survive in the long term, and they have a safe and secure job, because that's going to be a key consideration for a lot of people, as whether they should return to work now or not, whether it's worth their while, whether they foresee the business lasting into the future. Or we have a lot of people on another side of our business contacting us about CV interview skills. So they're obviously a lot of people are looking out at the moment and seeing what's the next avenue of approach for them. What can they do if they don't believe there's a long-term future in this business? So when you do bring your staff back, do encourage them, do motivate them, and do let them know that they're here to stay and you're going to invest in them into the future. So that's what I have for you guys today. So I just want to thank again Caoimhe, Dee, and all at Limerick Chamber for having us. We'll follow up through Caoimhe with all this information from you. My contact details will be on it, so anyone is welcome to drop us an email, touch base with us in any way if they have any questions or queries that they'd like clarified, or any advice we can give whatsoever, we can do that. So thanks very much for joining the session today.